You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host, Ankit Panda from New York City.
I'm your co-host Prashant Parmaswaran from Washington, D.C.
How's it going this week, Prashant?
Good. How are you doing?
Doing well. It's good to be back as always. And we'll be devoting this week's episode to the Indian Ocean, which has been particularly hot lately, but a warm topic of great interest to us at the Diplomat for the past few years. And indeed, regional observers in South Asia have been paying quite a bit of attention to geopolitical dynamics in the Indian Ocean region. It is certainly turning out to be one of the more contested maritime spaces in the Asia-Pacific or the Indo-Pacific, whatever you want to call it. We actually just happened to have run a great feature article for listeners that might not keep up with Indian Ocean affairs, written by David Brewster, who's a scholar that actually works on this quite closely, and he has a great rundown of the changing geopolitical dynamics in the region. So if you find yourself a little bit lost by some of the things we're talking about on this podcast, that might be a good resource to refer to. So Prashant, there's a few things on the agenda today, right? So we'll talk a bit about the crisis in the Maldives, and that might sound like a small issue in a small country, but it's actually not, and we'll get a bit at that in the course of the discussion, I hope. But then we can zoom out a bit and talk a bit about basically this networking that's going on around the Indian Ocean littoral and both in the Indian Ocean itself with various island states like the Maldives and Sri Lanka, Mauritius, to a lesser extent, the Seychelles as well. There is this game underway between India and China. Indian strategists have been worried about a so-called string of pearls for some time now. That phrase actually comes from a mid-2000s report by none other than Booz Allen Hamilton. So, but it has stuck in the Indian strategic imagination that India is being encircled by a range of Chinese ports, everywhere from Gwadar in Pakistan to ports in Myanmar, Sri Lanka, and China's first overseas military base in Djibouti. So there is something to this, certainly. And then we can reflect a bit on the Indo-Pacific concept, which I think we've been talking about a lot on these podcasts, but certainly the first half of that phrase, Indo, very much brings the Indian Ocean region into the strategic imagination of not only India, but its like-minded partners, including the United States, Australia, and Japan, certainly, and to a lesser extent, countries like Indonesia. Great. So where should we start?
I think we can probably start with the Maldives because that's been and I guess still continues to be the sort of major source of international headlines. And I guess the sort of initial framing consideration is on February 5th, the government of President Abdullah Yameen announced this 15-day state of emergency, which really thrust the Maldives, which isn't usually in the international spotlight or limelight beyond those of us who follow it pretty closely. And that state of emergency was extended last week by another 30 days. And this, it was really a case of things boiling over following a real deterioration in rule of law since Yameen came to power, really, back in 2013, all the way back there, when we've seen a crackdown on opposition voices, including former President Nasheed. And meanwhile, I guess under that state of emergency, where this fits into our broader geopolitical conversation, is that there have been calls by members of the opposition, but also some voices within India for India to intervene in some way. Some of this harks back to previous instances of where India has intervened in one way or the other. The clearest demonstration of that being military intervention back in 1988, and also this conversation about Chinese inroads into India and the neighborhood. And so I guess one useful place to start the conversation on Maldives is to sort of look at what India's options are here, how it's played its hand so far, and how we see that moving forward. I think the two ends of the spectrum that have been presented is, on the one hand, India sitting by and seeing, Chinese inroads in its neighborhood, including in the Maldives. We've seen, the signing of a free trade agreement between, China and the Maldives, which took some people by surprise, but it was really, a latest step in a series of moves that we've seen China take with respect to the Maldives. And then, the other end of the spectrum, which is, India taking a more active interventionist role. But I guess the thing that'll be interesting for us to explore here is, what is the end game for India here, right? So India's problem in the Maldives seems to be it's not one of an individual leader. It's governments, even democratically elected ones in within South Asia and beyond, right? They're increasing their economic links with China that India perceives to be undermining its own strategic interests. India had problems with President Nasheed as well, and Yameen today continually. So, I mean, what are your thoughts about India's options with respect to Maldives, and how do you see India playing its hand moving forward?
Yeah, thanks for framing that very well, Prashant. I think you're right that India has been put in a bit of a pickle here with the situation in the Maldives, and the main reason for that is that no matter what India does, India makes a choice that will have important implications for this broader geopolitical game in the Indian Ocean. Doing nothing and letting this crisis play out in itself is a dramatic option for India, and that makes things quite difficult. So. So intervention is certainly or has been certainly at the top of the conversation among sort of strategic elites in New Delhi. A lot of them will point to India's successful power projection in the past in the Indian Ocean. In 1988, the Indian Navy basically saved Mamun Gayoom, who was the autocratic ruler of the Maldives for 30 years, from a coup attempt by mercenaries by dispatching troops on his request. It was called Operation Cactus. It was broadly successful, won India quite some goodwill in the Maldives. And actually, Mamun is Yameen's half brother, and he's currently still active in Maldivian politics. But this isn't 1988. And not only that, this is not a case where the sitting president is requesting Indian assistance. In fact, quite the opposite. I think the government would like to see India stay out. The opposition, meanwhile, most prominently Mohammad Nasheed, who has a complicated relationship with India, but right now New Delhi has he is getting quite some airtime. There was a bit of a controversy recently because I think he implied he had some conversations with India's defense minister that he didn't actually have in the way that he presented it. I think he said that he briefed the Indian defense minister, which put India in a bit of a pickle again. But he is very vocally calling for India to play a role in restoring democratic normalcy. And this has been a long time refrain for him. He received medical leave to go into exile in London. He's actually been splitting his time between the UK and Sri Lanka. But right now, it seems like India is not quite ready to dispatch its military to intervene. Not only because, like I said, this would be an intervention against the will of a sitting government, and we can talk about the legitimacy of Yameen's government at this point, but the fact remains that it would not be a uniformly popular move for India to do this in the Indian Ocean region, and obviously other Indian neighbors are watching as well. Listeners may be aware that India's neighborhood is a complicated place. India has seen relationships wax and wane, and there are strategic commentators in New Delhi who've just been pointing to the fact that this is what happens when you have a neighborhood like India does. I mean, governments come and go, friendships wax and wane, interests are eternal for India, but the relationships that it has with specific governments in South Asia and in the Indian Ocean will change with due time. I mean, India saw this in Sri Lanka when Rajapaksa left and Sirisena came to office with a more balanced approach to Sri Lankan foreign policy. It has seen ebbs and flows in Nepal that we've talked about on this podcast. Currently now in another period of an ebb with KP Oli back on top. But I think a lot of that, when it comes to specifically the question of what to do in the Maldives, there are various shades of gray. It's not a decision between military intervention and doing nothing. There are several intermediary steps, and right now India's been playing its cards close to its chest. There's been a lot of it appears that anything that India is doing right now is very much being kept in the dark, occurring behind the scenes. The extension of the state of the emergency, I think, again, sends a message to New Delhi that Yameen is not sensitive to Indian requests here. He's also dispatched diplomats to China. And for India, I think, the long-term outcome in the Maldives, thinking maybe 10, 20 years down the line, is to see this country still have some possibility to return to India's sphere of influence, or at least not become a sort of Chinese outpost in the Indian Ocean. And I think, India recognizes, like you pointed out, that all of these Indian Ocean countries have their own national interests, their own self-interest to look out for, and they will find attractive sources of capital in China, and it's very difficult to say no to that. Sri Lanka, I think, has seen the dark side of that with some of the debt traps that it's experienced with various projects like the Hambantota port project. And the Maldives hasn't quite had that experience yet with China, but it may do so in due time, and you may see more domestic opposition to Chinese involvement in the country. India does have a long history in the Maldives. There are close cultural ties there as well that may have benefits for New Delhi in the future. So India's really in a difficult position. It's difficult to know how India will behave in the coming weeks. Military intervention, again, I should point out, obviously, you never know. It's easier said than done, especially in this context. Once you intervene, what do you do after that? How do you, remove Yamin from power, potentially bring Nasheed back? How does that affect the polarized situation on the ground? There are all these questions that India would have to have very good answers to justify military intervention. And of course, we can talk about the international legal rationale, which will probably not be forthcoming, at least from the UN Security Council, given that China can simply veto any Indian action there. So India would presumably have to act without international legitimacy as well, and that, of course, has costs for India's interests elsewhere. India is quite sensitive to appearing like anything like a pariah state. So I think anything that India would do, it would want to do with international legal sanction, or if not that, then wider sanction from a range of countries, presumably the United States, Japan, but I just simply don't see the diplomacy going in that direction right now.
Yeah, I think the way you framed it is definitely interesting and something to watch because you're already seeing with the extension of the state of emergency, India, the U.S., and a number of other countries saying that they hope that this doesn't continue, and indications that there could be certain steps that are taken that are, to the effect of economic sanctions, in addition to moves that have already been taken, including travel advisories, and so this may be something that's only beginning in the Maldives, and so it really will be interesting to see how that plays out. I do think since this is a geopolitics podcast, the other development that was interesting that occurred alongside this that gives a sense to the strategic weight of the Maldives in this broader conversation is the fact that we saw these news developments. I think initially a Reuters report, but also some other places as well, saying that we had the Chinese Navy moving into the Eastern Indian Ocean. And subsequent clarification by the Indians that it actually was transiting through the Sunda Strait, exiting through the Lombok Strait, and essentially, the conversation then evolved into whether this was something that had happened independent of what happened in the Maldives, or whether China was trying to send some kind of signal to India in the Maldives. So that's something I think that was, irrespective of what it actually was, it did seem to me that it was an indicator of how domestic political developments in a very small country in South Asia can then radiate into this broader strategic dynamics, which some people would argue is maybe a good thing in terms of framing India's foreign policy, but it can also result in you inflating threat perceptions that otherwise should be kept on a level here in terms of not considering foreign policy options that are way out there, including military intervention.
Yeah.
But you wrote about this deployment specifically and mentioned the implications there and offered a cautionary word. Maybe we can say a word about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one thing we haven't mentioned is that all of this is also playing out in the aftermath of the Duqm standoff last year, which was an incredibly significant episode in India-China bilateral ties, has left quite a bit of mistrust in India of Chinese intentions. Mm-hmm. Certainly, India is watching Chinese movements in the Himalayas and the Indian Ocean more closely than ever. So yeah, there was this exercise that by all accounts actually appears to have been a pre-planned exercise. The timing just isn't great. And obviously, we harp about freedom of navigation on this podcast all the time. So obviously the Chinese Navy has every right to, enter the Indian Ocean to conduct some exercise. I mean, I think one of the sources, defense sources that spoke to Times of India, I think said that, India can't say anything about Chinese Navy ships 3,500 kilometers away from the Maldives. I mean, the Indian Ocean is the third largest ocean on the planet. So certainly, if the Chinese Navy enters, it's not necessarily sending a signal. And, signaling is this very tricky thing. I mean, it's often, there's a ton of confirmation bias at work. If you're looking for an assertive signal, you will find it. A military exercise in, off the coast of Indonesia is not, what I think would send a message to New Delhi that China is ready to block any Indian attempt at intervention. Of course, things could change, and maybe there are some conversations that we don't know about between the Maldivians and the Chinese that could lead to some kind of arrangement by the People's Liberation Army conducting patrols around the Maldives. That kind of thing, I think, would really get to India. But yeah, this whole Chinese exercise thing was, I think, getting a little bit blown up in certain sectors of the strategic community in India. I think it just turned out to be a little bit of a nothing burger.
Yep, absolutely. And I do think, it's also important to emphasize, to listeners that the idea of the People's Liberation Army Navy in the Indian Ocean is something that is really a new normal. I mean, the regularization of Chinese presence there is a reality that India and other countries have increasingly had to accept in a similar way in which India is playing more and more in the South China Sea and some parts of Chinese neighborhood as well. So this is something that's part of a broader trend that's already ongoing rather than an isolated event. Too.
Right, absolutely. I mean, the Indian strategists have been very used to seeing Chinese naval assets in the Indian Ocean. I mean, yes, I mean, they, there are regular freakouts in New Delhi when a Chinese submarine pulls up in Colombo or something like that. It I think serves as a wake up call of sorts that India needs to ensure that its strategic footprint in the Indian Ocean remains strong. And there is this refrain between India and China where China is determined to not let the Indian Ocean become India's ocean, and certain sectors of the community in New Delhi, would prefer for India to maintain strategic primacy in the Indian Ocean. But obviously, you don't get primacy without laying out the assets, and the Chinese have been able to do that at a much greater rate than the Indians have been able to keep up with.
Yep, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. So should we talk a bit about the broader geopolitical context in the Indian Ocean?
Yeah, sounds good.
Yeah, so so Narendra Modi was recently in Oman, and Oman is not a country that comes up on this podcast quite often, primarily because it's not in Asia, but it is certainly on the Indian Ocean. And India signed an agreement with Oman to develop a military site at the port of Duqm, which is located on the southern coast of Oman, overlooking the Arabian Sea. It's a strategically located port facility. And we were talking about this idea of a string of pearls. India has been trying to expand its own network of bases. But Prashant, I think what's quite interesting to look at now is the geometry in the Indian Ocean of just a variety of facilities. So on one hand, we have the Chinese facilities that we've already talked about a little bit. But then on the other hand, we've been talking a lot about the renewed quadrilateral after the naval chiefs met in New Delhi in January, and this whole idea of the Indo-Pacific strategy gaining currency in Canberra, Tokyo, Washington, and New Delhi. So there's this idea of now a sort of, concert of democracies. Again, we don't know. This isn't an alliance, but I think they can. This grouping of states can tell you what it stands for in the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, which is freedom of navigation, open sea lanes, rule of law, peaceful resolution of disputes, all that jazz. But when you look at the Indian Ocean, you see a site like Duqm. You look at the Indian facility at Chabahar in Iran. You look at Assumption Island in the Seychelles, which is where India is actually building a minor naval facility. It was talked up a little bit. The Seychelles people have politics changed there, so I think they have maintained a degree of sovereignty over that facility that doesn't quite give India free reign. Agalega in Mauritius, and of course the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, a sovereign part of India, incredibly well located right next to the mouth of the Malacca Strait. And then, let's talk about the other members of the Quad. Obviously, you have the U.S. Navy with its logistics, a naval facility at Diego Garcia, a British possession, and with the Logistics Exchange Memorandum of Agreement concluded with the United States in 2016 between the U.S. and India, both countries can have reciprocal access to each other's facilities. And then Australia is planning on improving the Cocos Islands and the southeastern Indian Ocean, potentially to support P-8 Poseidon operations for anti-submarine warfare, maritime domain awareness operations in the wider Indian Ocean region. So when you put all of this together, you start to see a pretty favorable network for these kind of like-minded countries in the Indian Ocean. And as far as this Indo-Pacific strategy goes, I mean, if the rubber is to really hit the road on these countries sort of serving as a patrolling the commons, making sure that the sea lanes do remain secure, that China isn't able to monopolize or capitalize on instability in the region for whatever purposes. I mean, when you start to see this network of facilities around the region, you start to feel like there is something here. But obviously, I think there are a lot of question marks again about how all of this is converted into something more real than just a network of disparate ports. I mean, right now it's all very. It looks pretty on a map. You can draw some lines, put it together, and it looks nice. But as far as the operationalization of anything goes, we're still in a very primordial phase.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that that's a really good cautionary note. I do think you can very easily, as you said, map these things out and see the linkages there, and these some of these facilities, bases, whatever you want to call them, logistics agreements. They really are important because they facilitate maintenance for vessels. They allow places for aircraft, for example, to potentially refuel, and that's really important. But you do also need the supporting infrastructure, the attendant aerial and naval capabilities to make use of these basing facilities. And we've talked, previously in podcasts before about the limits of India's military modernization, and also really the fact that when we're talking about the revival of Asia's Quad, the fact that you do have to acknowledge the fact that there isn't really that much of a perfect alignment of strategic priorities that affects long-term strategic planning, right? So you do have those limitations. That being said, I mean, I do agree. I mean, this agreement that India struck is significant. It's something that India and Oman have already been talking about increasing their defense cooperation, right? They've been talking about maritime security cooperation, Coast Guard cooperation. But Duqm really is a significant strategic area. And we don't know, obviously, all the information about the agreements that were struck, but even the public versions of the statements that came out suggested significant alignment there.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, one other, I guess, cautionary note I would point out is as we're linking these various facilities together, you correctly mentioned that all these facilities are not necessarily equal, right? Some of these are logistics agreements that India has reached with, for example, the United States, with Singapore. Last year they reached one. They reached one with France to open up access to facilities. Others, like the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, is a command that the Indian military has set up that manages some of India's defense activities. So these things, when you combine them together, it's important to recognize that there are differences between them. They can't really be combined in perfection. And some of these other facilities, including Duqm, they've been open to other countries as well, not just India, right? So Duqm was open to the UK last year, for example, and these countries they benefit strategically and sometimes also economically from opening these port facilities. So if the Chinese and other countries that are beyond this quadrilateral network come in and they offer a better deal, there's no telling whether these countries will put those considerations above strategic considerations that are of concern to India and the United States and Australia. So that's the other cautionary note I think we should keep in mind, because ultimately geography is not destiny, right?
Absolutely. No, I think that's a really good note to end on. And actually, just on Duqm, what's funny is that there's a massive special economic zone there, and obviously there's a ton of Chinese capital swimming around there. So
Yep.
it is. I mean, the Omanis are very much open to doing business with both India and China. And Djibouti has a very similar model. I mean, you have the Chinese base right next to a U.S. base and a Japanese base. So I mean, all of these countries, can play both sides, and as long as the geopolitics in the Indian Ocean remains as hot as it has been, I think they'll find more ways to have a range of agreements with both India and China.
Yep.
All right, Prashant. We'll probably come back to the Indian Ocean soon enough. But thanks for joining me today.
Yep. Good to be with you.
Great. And for listeners, if you like what you heard on the podcast, make sure you subscribe. And if you have been a subscriber for a while, but you haven't left us a review, please do so on either iTunes or Google Play. It really helps get the word out about the show. Thanks a lot for listening, and we'll be back next week with more.